You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The Chicago Bears gave Ryan Poles his first shot in the NFL as an undrafted rookie free agent. And now the same organization is giving him his first shot to call the shots as the Chicago Bears' new general manager. This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm an analyst for Pro Football Focus, and I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Today's episode is brought to you by OnlineGambling.com, the place to be for all the latest gambling news and tips throughout the NFL playoffs. Visit OnlineGambling.com/NFL to get the edge over the competition all the way through to the big game. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and every day. On the show today, we're getting to know the new head of this organization, the new general manager, the beginning of a new regime and a new era, going from one Ryan P to a new Ryan P, Pace to Poles in Chicago. We'll find out a little bit more about who Ryan Poles is, his background, how he sort of worked his way up to get to this point of being the Chicago Bears general manager, maybe some of the philosophies he's picked up along the way, some of the front offices he's worked for, the philosophies that he may have picked up in those organizations and all that sort of thing. We'll kind of look at specifically his time with the Kansas City Chiefs, where he's been his whole career, but what the Chiefs have done, how their front office structure is different from the Bears, and what he's been able to do in his roles within that front office structure, and how that could translate potentially to what he's going to do as the Chicago Bears general manager. We wrap up kind of looking at what's next for him as he turns his attention right away to the head coaching search, already conducting interviews for who he wants to be his head coach, but how involved are George McCaskey and Ted Phillips and Bill Polian going to be in that? Is he going to get to pick his own head coach, or is this going to be a Ryan Pace, John Fox thing where the head coach is sort of picked for him? But let's get to know Ryan Poles, because I do think as we dig more into him, he checks all the boxes that you're looking for in a general manager candidate. Does that mean he's going to be a home run GM and be the one to bring a Super Bowl to the Chicago Bears? Not necessarily. I mean, there's no perfect formula for picking a GM candidate. In many ways, Ryan Pace checked a lot of those types of boxes for the Bears in that role. And other GMs across the NFL have had a strong resume that just end up not doing well in that spot. But I do think he does have the resume, Ryan Poles, that is. He is a former player. And I think he's able to come into this role with at least some of that experience, right? It's not a prerequisite, but it does help to know physically what your players are going through and to be able to really, truly understand the game at a high level, having played it. He was an offensive lineman at Boston College. He actually blocked for Matt Ryan at Boston College, if that gives you a sense of how old he is. I mean, he's 36. He's a fairly young general manager, a real fast-rising up-and-comer, went undrafted out of Boston College. The Bears signed him as a UDFA, did not make the 53-man roster. Now we'll be deciding the 53-man roster for that very same Bears team. But I think as a former offensive lineman, you can guess as a general manager, he's probably going to put a pretty strong value on that position, or at least have a strong appreciation for that position. And that should be welcome for Justin Fields and for this Bears offense in general, regardless of who the head coach is going to be. But you look at his time in Kansas City. He spent his whole career there after Boston College, 13 seasons, and he's worked his way up. Really, he came in as a scouting assistant and then became a college scouting coordinator, is sort of the role that they call basically like their area scouts of sorts. I'm trying to get a sense of like translating the Bears, the Chiefs front office roles to like Bears front office roles. I think this college scouting coordinator might be a little bit above a regular old area scout, but whether it's a regional scout, I mean, there's some different sort of lenient, like lineages in how these teams call things in their front office, but runs college scouting or coordinates college scouting for a while, then becomes their director of college scouting in 2016 for a few years, then promoted to assistant director of player personnel, then executive director of player personnel, and now, of course, the Chicago Bears general manager. And so across those 13 seasons, Ryan Poles, boy, I find myself saying Pace before and having to stop myself and say Poles. So I'm going to end up kind of mixing them up once or twice in their names being so similar. But Ryan Poles worked under 3 different general managers in Kansas City. And it's not totally uncommon for like scouts to stick on as general managers change sometimes within organizations, but still it is impressive to survive 3 of them across, a dozen years. And an interesting group of 3, John Dorsey, Scott Pioli, and now Brett Veach, each one kind of going through different forms of rebuilds and trying to build that franchise up to be something. Of course, John Dorsey came up in that Green Bay Packers, Ron Wolf type front office system there. Dorsey, much more of like a hard-nosed football guy, a little bit more like not anti-analytics, but definitely not embracing analytics. You got Scott Pioli being more of a Patriots system type guy. I mean, he was with the Seahawks and a couple of their teams, but was very much entrenched in the Bill Belichick world quite a bit. And then I moved on to be assistant general manager with the Atlanta Falcons over Dan Quinn, who we'll definitely get to more of him later on in the podcast today. And then, of course, now Brett Veach is currently the Chiefs general manager. And so it seems like as we dig into Ryan Poles a little bit more, he's been a guy who's been okay with risk in some spots in certain positions as a decision maker, but not throwing caution in the wind and really trying to swing for the fences all the time, but kind of knowing when he wants to be stable and build up slowly and when he wants to take a big swing on someone, say, like Patrick Mahomes. But it has seemed like the Chiefs have been inclined to, and we'll get into some of the Chiefs things here in just a moment, but like you look at the Chiefs roster last year, 13 of their 22 players all came through the NFL draft. And it just so happens that Ryan Poles was in charge of the NFL draft for quite a while there in that Kansas City organization. We'll take a little bit of a close look at that Chiefs front office structure in particular, some of the moves that they've done over the years that have gone particularly well, maybe a couple of them that haven't gone well, to kind of get a sense of, okay, what is Poles' track record within that Chiefs organization? Is he seem to be doing the things you would want to see a candidate do before he becomes GM? Not a guaranteed translation there, but at least, hey, how well has he done in his previous roles to at least project him forward as the general manager? And then, of course, stuff to get at what his head coaching search is going to look like. All that coming up next on Locked On Bears. Today's episode brought to you by our friends at OnlineGambling.com. I mean, we're all looking for an edge when it comes to gambling, and our friends at OnlineGambling.com give bettors the edge. Throughout the playoffs, they're providing you with the best NFL tips, news, and more to help make your bets as informed as ever. Of course, early on in this process, our friends at Online Gambling had us put our Super Bowl picks in, and I thought, for sure either be the Packers or Buccaneers in for the NFC, and of course, neither one of them makes it to the NFC Championship game. Still thinking the Chiefs are probably going to be the ones to get there after they beat the Bills the way they did, but my predictions there were not holding on well. I still think I'm going to stick with the Chiefs as we look ahead, but I think I'm going to go Rams here over the 49ers. I just don't trust Jimmy Garoppolo to be able to do it again and get back to the Super Bowl, even with that 49ers team having some good stuff there. Our friends at OnlineGambling.com have made their own Super Bowl picks as well, which you can find in the OG Tips section on their website. So make sure you visit OnlineGambling.com/NFL for all the latest gambling news, tips, and odds to make sure you have the edge all throughout the postseason. Remember, OnlineGambling.com/NFL to make the most out of all your opportunities all the way up through the big game. Seems like Ryan Poles made the most out of his opportunities throughout the Kansas City Chiefs organization as he worked his way all the way up to the top. And one of the things that strikes me right away when you look at the Chiefs compared to the Bears, at least under Ryan Pace, was the depth of the front office. The NFL doesn't set specific rules as to a salary cap for front office, the GM and the player personnel and pro personnel. In the same way that you can spend whatever you want on coaches, you can spend whatever you want on general managers. And much like the coaching staff too, there's not really a limit or a minimum on the number of coaches you can have on your staff or the number of directors and vice presidents and assistants and all that you can have in your front office. And it seems like this Chiefs front office, while Poles has been there, has been a little bit deeper in terms of a larger staff for the most part. Right now you look at Brett Veach as the general manager, and then they have an assistant GM, a VP of football operations. Poles was the executive director of player personnel. They also have a director of player personnel, a director of pro personnel, the director of college scouting, the assistant director of college scouting, and a college scouting coordinator. So that I didn't even count those before I started reading them out loud. But if you look at it, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 or so people plus Poles would make it like 10, I guess, in that front office compared to, say, like the Chicago Bears, who have a GM, a player personnel, of college scouting, and a football administrator, and then an assistant director of player personnel. Like it was Pace as the GM, Josh Lucas, Champ Kelly, Max Sadowski, and Joseph Lane. And then I guess Cliff Stein was the negotiator, the general counsel, senior vice president. But really, like, that executive team was 5 people: a GM, college scouting, player personnel, director of player, assistant director, and then a football administration guy. Like, it was sort of that 5-man personnel, and the Chiefs were more like 10, or depending on how you want to put who in what part of the pantheon there. But like, seems like we could expect Poles to build out maybe a little bit more robust of a front office. That's not to say that more people always equals better. Sometimes there can be too many cooks in the kitchen, and it requires good leadership, good structure, a good hierarchy to know everyone's got their roles and what they're supposed to do to get the most out of the people that you do have in the building. So it's not to say it's better or worse, just more to say that it is probably going to be different. And so when you look at what that front office in Kansas City was able to do, of course, I mean, it starts with Patrick Mahomes, which, feels like a lot of luck, right? I mean, even though they had a lot of conviction on Mahomes and really thought he was going to be the best quarterback, I don't know that anybody knew he would be looking like potentially the greatest quarterback of all time. I mean, the most talented, the most spectacular, of doing things we've never seen before. I don't know if they could fully have anticipated just how good Mahomes was. So there's some luck involved with there. Of course, when they drafted Mahomes, Poles was not like intimately, he was their director of college scouting at the time, 2016, 2018. So he was right in those discussions with Brett Veach. I'm not to say that like Poles deserves all the credit for Mahomes per se, but he was in charge of the drafts at the time. And throughout his time as the college scouting coordinator, and then the director of college scouting, it seems like the Chiefs were able to hit on a lot of their first round picks fairly consistently over that time. Eric Berry was the first round pick in 2010. They miss on Jonathan Baldwin, the wide receiver, in 2011. For sure, big time bust there, the 26th overall pick. But then Dontari Poe, solid nose tackle. Eric Fisher struggled at first as the number 1 overall pick as a tackle, but really kind of settled in over time and looks like a solid starting NFL offensive tackle now, and really got there. Dee Ford at edge rusher, not a home run at 23, but a starting caliber edge rusher. I mean, not a total bust, but not great. Of course, Marcus Peters, a great starting cornerback for them. Didn't have a first round pick in 2016, but first pick was Chris Jones, the defensive lineman. Great steal for them at 37. Then you have Mahomes, and then they haven't had first round picks since then, or for a couple of years after that, because of the trade up for Mahomes. The last couple of years, Poles has moved on to a higher up position, and it has felt like their drafts haven't been as good once he became their director of player personnel as opposed to the director of college scouting. You look through, it just seems like generally the Chiefs, with under him running their college scouting, hit on most of their top 100 picks. He didn't have the Ryan Pace late round gems nearly as often, but I think it's more important to hit those top 100 picks. Like, that's where you find like the true difference makers. Like, Pace had to make up for his misses by finding the late round guys because he was missing so much earlier in the draft. But like, Poles just hits the ones you're supposed to hit, or seem to, in Kansas City, at least at a better than average clip compared to a lot of other teams in how they've drafted. Not that it's been perfect, but doing pretty well. And then I think there's no surprise that this past season, when Poles was promoted to executive director of player personnel, which is then in charge of both the draft, the college, and the pro scouting, right? Player personnel, so it's kind of a weird front office terminology, but there's college scouting and pro personnel, which is fairly straightforward, right? College scouting is all the draft stuff. Pro personnel is like free agency and trades and other teams. Above college and pro is what's called the player personnel department, which encompasses both. That's the umbrella that includes pro and college. So when he's executive director of player personnel, he is overseeing the college scouting and the pro scouting. So he went from directing the college to going up to player personnel, which is above college and pro. It's a little bit convoluted, but hopefully it sort of makes sense when you think about it in the hierarchy of college and pro are on the same level, and then player personnel looks over both of those. Poles took over above college and above pro as player personnel. His only year doing that was 2021, and it's no surprise then that the former offensive lineman in that role completely rebuilt the Chiefs' offensive line in one off season. I mean, clearly it was a need after the Super Bowl, the way that went against the Buccaneers, but like the offensive lineman going to prioritize the offensive line position. They drafted Creed Humphrey and Trey Smith. They signed a couple of free agents in Austin Blythe and Joe Thuney, and they also traded for Orlando Brown to just get a brand new rebuilt group in there. They cut both of their tackles, and unlike the Bears, who also cut both of their tackles, Chiefs actually improved their offensive line and rebuilt it and didn't just sort of patch it together. Because, Pace did draft two players, just like Ryan Poles did here with rebuilding his offensive line. But of course, Pace didn't invest the financial dollars, in part because he didn't have it in the free agents and didn't go out and trade for Orlando Brown, which again was a kind of a high risk move there. I guess not high risk, but you know what I mean, not a surefire thing. Exactly how the Brown situation was going to play out. But so it seems like Poles has done well in all of his personnel opportunities. Pretty good salary cap negotiating for Veach as their GM, and that's the thing too. It's like you don't want to give Poles all the credit for the players they drafted, or this year all the credit for the offensive line changes that they did, but it seems like he's been more intimately involved in growing this process, and Brett Veach, their GM, has been very complimentary about what Poles' roles is a tough one to say, what Poles' roles have been in helping build out that Chiefs team. And so I think there's, again, the Chiefs kind of checking that box as a successful, stable organization with good team building foundation that Poles has been a part of. That's what you're looking for in a GM candidate. Not a guarantee that it's going to instantly make him a great GM, but it's again a box, one of the main boxes you're checking when you're trying to decide which of these guys to hire. So that's how the Bears end up landing on Poles, and now it's up to Poles to get a head coach in here. The most important decision he's going to make at this point, because the quarterback decision has already been made for him for now. So now the most important decision is going to be who coaches Justin Fields, not only as the offensive coordinator, but then the head coach as well. And we'll kind of get into what Poles might be looking at, where his connections are to these camps, and what kind of meddling George and Ted and Bill Polian might be getting involved in there. Coming up next on Locked On Bears. All right, Bears fans, I want to tell you about a new app for anybody who buys gasoline. It's called GetUpside. And Locked On Bears listeners are earning cash back for every gallon of gas every time they fill up. You just download the free GetUpside app in the App Store or Google Play and enter in our promo code Touchdown, and you're going to get 25 cents per gallon or more cash back on your fill-ups. Don't pay full price at the pump anymore. Some people who drive a lot are making as much as $200 to $300 a year in cash back, and really, there's no catch here, right? The cash back gets added right to your GetUpside account, and then you can cash out at any time. You don't have to wait for a certain amount or anything. Anytime you want to cash out, you can connect your bank account for a direct deposit. If you'd rather go through PayPal, they've got that hooked up as well. Or you can cash out to an e-gift card for an online retailer like Amazon or other brands. So super easy. All you got to do, fill up gas like you always do at the gas station, download the free GetUpside app, enter in our promo code Touchdown, and you're going to get 25 cents per gallon or more cash back on your first tank. That's promo code Touchdown on the GetUpside app. If your New Year's resolutions are still hanging in there, still trying to eat a little healthier or maybe get a little more fit, then you got to make sure you have Built Bars as part of your diet, part of your pantry, part of your rotation. I just got a box of the Churro Built Puffs in this week. They're basically like chocolate-covered marshmallows that have like a churro cinnamon type flavoring in there. It tastes delicious. I mean, they are just phenomenal. It does taste like a candy bar, but it doesn't have all the extra sugar and junk that you don't need in a candy bar. Because every Built Bar, whether it's a Built Puff or Built Bar or Built Bites, they're all covered in 100% real chocolate. They're soft, they're easy to chew, but most importantly, they are all low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. You can't find any other protein bar product on the market that tastes this good, really legitimately like a candy bar, but is that good for you. Head on over to built.com and use our promo code LOCKED15, and you're going to get 15% off your next order. I just used that promo code on my reorder. Promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. when the Bears hired a young general manager the last time in Ryan Pace, they kind of more or less directed him to hire John Fox or hired John Fox for him, right? The idea was to pair a younger general manager with a more veteran, experienced head coach. And so, given that the Bears already finalized a list of 3 candidates to be finalists for the head coach before officially hiring Ryan Poles as the general manager, we're left kind of weary that, will he be given a head coach or will he get the chance to pick his own head coach the way Ryan Pace wasn't able to the first time, but certainly was able to the second time? And some of the reporting that we've seen, and some of it comes from different places, and it's sort of hard to tell what all is completely true and what all is speculation, but it sounds like perhaps Poles has been adamant about being able to interview the finalists himself and make his own head coach decision. And I think that is, first of all, the smart and right thing for the organization to do, to not just say, Poles, you have to have this head coach. That relationship between GM and head coach is far too important, and they need to be able to make sure that Poles is getting his guy so he can really be his team and have that relationship, that identity, and a shared sort of vision for what things are going to go. So that's good. But also I think it's a good sign that Poles feels empowered and strong and charismatic enough to be able to sort of foot down with ownership and the team president and say, no, if you want me to be the general manager, let me build my team. And to be able to sort of stand up to them, I think shows strong leadership and character and all these things that you would, again, check these boxes for potentially why he could be a good general manager candidate. And so he is personally interviewing, at least for now, all of the finalists that Bill Polian has helped the front office pick. I believe yesterday, Jim Caldwell got an interview, like the same day that Poles was hired. He interviewed Jim Caldwell as in charge of the organization. And then I believe Dan Quinn has his second interview scheduled for now today, Wednesday, as you listen to the podcast. And I think Matt Eberflus is also scheduled for today. At least that's what the reporting seemed to be, but it's been a little bit unclear exactly on how these timelines will go. And it's possible that Poles could have other candidates in mind that he'd also like to bring in to still interview. As of the time I'm recording this, we haven't heard of any of those specifically yet, but he's thought to maybe have some connection to Brian Flores, but we haven't really seen that turn into any formal reporting on another interview happening there. But it's just interesting that the Dan Quinn connection continue to kind of be at the forefront of things. We've seen some reporting that Polian would really prefer a Caldwell, but it seems like Dan Quinn would be the one with the strongest connections here to Ryan Poles, because Ryan Poles was an offensive lineman at Boston College, where he blocked for Matt Ryan of the Atlanta Falcons. And not only did he block for Matt Ryan, I had read, and I haven't been able to confirm this, but reportedly, he and Ryan were college roommates. And I believe, I don't remember which direction this was. I'm pretty sure it was Matt Ryan was the best man at Ryan Poles' wedding, or it might have been the other way around, where Poles was the best man at Ryan's wedding. But regardless, best man at the wedding, college roommate type connection between Ryan Poles and Matt Ryan. And so you could see where Matt Ryan's opinion of Dan Quinn might go a long way as to whether or not Ryan Poles wants to hire Dan Quinn. Of course, we mentioned earlier that Poles worked under Pioli, and Pioli worked with Quinn in Atlanta as well. So Poles can kind of go to Pioli and say, and kind of get a sense of how things were for Quinn in Atlanta, and then know what to ask Quinn specifically then in his second interview in Chicago. It's also interesting that Dan Quinn scheduled his second interview with the Bears before his second interview with the Broncos. And there's some, again, reporting, speculation, thoughts that perhaps the Bears are Dan Quinn's preferred destination. I think he's also interviewed with either the Vikings or the Giants as well. So he certainly has a lot of interest, but seems to perhaps be more interested in the Bears. So could that be a natural sort of draw together as an experienced head coach, or at least an experienced coach? He was a head coach before with the Falcons, and we went really in depth on all three of those finalists on yesterday's podcast, Caldwell, Quinn, and Eberflus. If you want to learn more about them and kind of catch up a little bit, go back and listen to that when you're done with today's episode of Locked On Bears, because we went through what Quinn did at Seattle and then what he did in Atlanta and some of the pros and cons and ups and downs of what he had there. Same thing with Caldwell with the Colts and the Lions, and even before that, and then Eberflus in his time with the Colts so far, and where he's kind of come up in the coaching ranks. And so you could see where if the Bears are particularly leaning towards a veteran head coach, it'd be more likely to be Caldwell or Quinn with Poles as opposed to Eberflus being the young up and coming guy. And you wonder if, whether it's Eberflus or Quinn, I guess, if Jim Caldwell could be the offensive coordinator, if that's going to be something Polian particularly pushes as, again, former Colts guys with big connections to those Colts coaches. So it'll be interesting to see what they do. I mean, Eberflus is supposed to get his interview at the same day as Quinn. Will he get a chance, or will they make sure that, if Quinn's last, we don't know exactly what order, but, Poles comes in for his second interview and they give him the job on the spot. They made sure he didn't leave without accepting some sort of offer, even though I believe the Bears may have still had other interviews to go, or at least we're looking at other candidates potentially still to bring in to interview, but they kind of said, no, we decided on Poles. And could the same thing happen with Quinn, where if he nails that second interview, does he not leave Chicago without getting that job? Do you let him go to Denver for that second interview later on this week, or the Vikings or the Giants or whoever else is probably going to end up interviewing? Feels like this is sort of the pathway that Bears fans are bracing for at this point. Who knows? Again, Poles could have his own candidates still in mind, could take a left turn or right turn now that he is in charge of this organization. But at least, hey, we have some answer about what this team is going to look like. And we'll learn more about Poles in the coming days and weeks as he has an introductory press conference. And we're also going to talk with Ryan Tracy from Locked On Chiefs about what he knows about Ryan Poles. He's actually met Ryan Poles before, covering the Kansas City Chiefs. I think has some good perspective on what the Bears might be getting from their general manager. So I hope you'll keep tuning in all week long and all offseason long to the Locked On Bears podcast. We are here for you 5 days a week. Thank you for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and every day with your daily in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Head coaching search, GM search, whatever's going to happen throughout the offseason, we'll be here for you to break it all down and hopefully, as a result, make it that much easier for you to bear down.